Hailing from the Jersey Shore and raised as athletes, the Airey Bros have always shared a passion for physical culture, athletic performance, and human optimization, always striving to be the strongest versions of themselves, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Along the way, they've met some pretty amazing humans and have had some pretty epic adventures. The intention of Airey Bros Radio is to showcase these amazing people and the impact that they've had on them, and to share tips, tricks, and hacks so that you can win each day, every day.
You're listening to Airey Bros Radio. Be there or be square, because it's all killer, no filler.
The fact that we talk about wrestling being one of the highest percentage of first-generation college students, that's a story in and of itself, that there are avenues and paths that wrestlers have taken to get into colleges that you don't hear about very often, right? And those are the stories that I think inspire people to want to follow and root for somebody too. If you don't have your championship season, you didn't have your season. So there were a lot of people really kind of arguing with the NCAA, really advocating for that eligibility to be given back for that year. We have 1,000 student athletes, so we're like a significant chunk of the student body here. Well, in the end of the day, most of our student athletes come here because they want that Ivy League education. 33 is the varsity number. It is not easy to do, and credit to anybody out there who is doing color commentary and play-by-play for any sport, for that matter. The hardest part is you don't realize how much downtime there is.
Do you have to catch yourself sometimes? You get excited during big matches?
So, yeah, absolutely. I think we really need to be focused on women's wrestling right now. This is Matt Valenti, and you're listening to Airey Bros Radio.
You just mentioned that, because of COVID, your job's kind of been a little bit crazier than normal. What has that added to your daily workload?
I mean, more than anything, it's been like trying to navigate all the COVID protocols and procedures and everything we have. Honestly, things just change on like a weekly basis. Trying to keep up with everything and keep our kids as healthy as we can so we can keep them out there competing. And it just is like chasing people around all the time, trying to make sure we could just get teams out and on the mat for wrestling or out in the basketball court. It's just wild west right now.
Yeah, and talking about dealing with the protocols and that sort of stuff, you guys, UPenn and the Ivy specifically had I guess a tough go last year where you guys didn't have any sports. What was that like? How was handling that like? Was your inbox flooded and your voicemails full on a regular basis?
Yeah, that was super interesting last year. So when COVID really hit back in 2020, Ivy League was kind of out in front of everything. They were the first ones to really shut things down, and we were canceling tournaments and canceling competition, and we sent our kids home pretty quickly, and that ended up being kind of the front end of what everybody else ended up doing. Fast forward to fall of 20 going into 2021, I think the Ivy League and the schools really thought the rest of the country was going to go down the same path that we went down, and I think they thought they were going to kind of be leaders in shutting down sports, but then nobody else followed suit. So, obviously a really difficult decision. I don't envy our leaders and kind of what they need to be thinking about when they make these decisions too. I mean, we're in the middle of a major city. We have 20,000 students here, but we also are part of a hospital system too. So, we just have all these moving parts connected to a school like Penn and all the different people that are at risk. I mean, looking at my window right now, there's a cancer research center right across the street. So we've got cancer patients who are like in that building right there, and then downstairs, actually in the basement below where I am right now. So you can appreciate, the thinking of trying to think globally about everybody who's here. But man, from an athletics standpoint, not having sports for a full year when you work in athletics, just on a personal level, was painful. But for our kids, just to have them watch their peers around the country still compete, I mean, that just was heartbreaking to see, and to try and explain that to them, that everybody else could figure out how to do it, but we couldn't figure out how to do it. There's really never a good answer for how that goes and how you explain that. And so it was a tough year. It was a really tough year, and it was really hard to watch and see competition around the country and watch our kids have to sit on the sidelines and manage through that.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Children's Hospital. I spent many days there as a youngster. I had severe asthma and allergies, so I'm very familiar with the grounds there at Children's Hospital. For better or worse, they definitely helped me out.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, being on the sidelines and as your job in the athletic department, is when there's no sports. People probably wonder, other than kind of deflecting or taking the brunt of some angry phone calls, maybe, what other sorts of things did you do without having sports? Did it give you an opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit, maybe be creative and come up with some new things for moving ahead once athletics got back up and running?
Yeah. So while we didn't have competition, we did end up having student athletes on campus. We did having students here. School was still happening. And so I actually oversee our academic support area here within athletics. So for us, actually, I would say to some degree, it actually got crazier. Trying to meet with student athletes over Zoom and trying to make sure that they're doing well in their classes when the only point of contact you can really have is a virtual meeting of some kind or a phone call. Made it really difficult to kind of navigate. But then also to deliver a ton of programming to make sure these kids are continuing to develop as human beings too. We had seniors who were still graduating college last year who still needed to figure out what they were doing after graduation, needed to find jobs, needed to do grad school applications. So we had to learn and adjust on the fly to how to deliver that to them in a virtual setting. And then obviously 2020, 21, from a social justice standpoint, there was a lot going on in the world. And we as a athletic department took it on ourselves to really explore what we can do in that space and how we can better support our diverse student athletes here on campus. And I actually was fortunate to be named a co-chair of the committee that ended up tackling a lot of that. So I spent a lot of time educating myself, educating my peers, and trying to develop a plan to help support our traditionally underrepresented minority student athletes that are here at Penn. We have 1,000 kids, so we have a lot of student athletes, and we've got a really diverse population. And historically, we haven't done a great job of supporting them as individuals. So it's an ongoing conversation and it's an ongoing effort. But I was very fortunate to kind of co-lead that effort and kind of push us on the path toward the future.
So talking about watching, all the other schools compete, but Ivy League couldn't. Did you guys lose a lot of athletes because of that?
We actually didn't. So silver lining of not competing was we did at least get a competition waiver for the year that we didn't compete, as opposed to that 2020 year where our wrestlers kind of got the short end of the stick in general when we canceled the NCAA championships. Ivy wrestlers actually got that year back. So, I mean, specifically to Ivy athletics, I think what we saw was, depending on the school, there was a slightly different setup of how they were supporting that. Schools like Princeton and Harvard had full classes sit out of school last year, so that they didn't lose their eligibility, and they came back this year and they're just going to be back on track, having had like a gap year mixed in. We did a little bit of that here at Penn, although probably not the same scale as some of the other schools. There are different ways that our student athletes can kind of extend their time so they can continue to compete at Ivy schools. The toughest was obviously the seniors, who were probably in a situation at that point where it was too late to figure out how to extend time or whether they wanted to take a leave or a gap year. There were a few student athletes across the Ivy Leagues who jumped ship to other schools. I think you see some of the Cornell guys who popped up on rosters across the country. Princeton had a couple here and there. But shockingly, that actually was not that significant of a number of student athletes you saw kind of jumping ship to go other places and leaving Ivy schools. And at the end of the day, most of our student athletes come here because they want that Ivy League education, and you transfer, you end up not getting it. Even if you're going into your senior year and you completed 3 years worth of schooling, you don't get that Ivy degree at the end of the day if you end up somewhere else. So a lot of them stuck around.
Yeah, you can't put 3 years at UPenn on your resume.
No, unfortunately, you just get that degree.
In 2020, the wrestlers losing that eligibility, and you being an AD, was there any kind of proactive stuff you were trying to do or other ADs were trying to do to get that NCAA tournament or anything back for those wrestlers, or was that kind of like a lost cause from the beginning?
Oh, no. I will tell you, ADs across the country were fighting tooth and nail to figure out how to make that work. And there was some prevailing sentiment that student athletes in winter sports got most of their season. So that was the justification as to why they wouldn't get eligibility back. But obviously for those of us who participated in winter sports, who participated in college sports in general, if you don't have your championship season, you didn't have your season. So there were a lot of people really kind of arguing with the NCAA, really advocating for that eligibility to be given back for that year. And the NCAA, unfortunately, wouldn't budge on that one. To this day, I don't fully understand that. Again, it's one of those things that I don't envy leadership positions and having to make some of those tough calls, because I know they had a thought process behind that led them to justify that decision at the end of the day. I couldn't tell you exactly what that was, but I certainly didn't necessarily agree with it. But they felt like that was the right approach, and the best way to support student athletes was to try and find other ways to help them. But that one, as somebody who obviously competed in NCAA championships, that hit me hard, and that hit a lot of us hard, that there were student athletes whose careers just ended like that. And to me, that's just a huge bummer and really not okay.
Yeah, talking about how they kind of sort of the mindset of the majority of the season got played out, but as championship athletes, we know that if you don't get you get through a conference and you're all ready to go chomping at the bit, and literally, the 2 days before they make that call, with the wrestling season be spread over 2 semesters, are you in favor of switching to a 1 semester season? And is that something that could be a possibility in the next couple of years?
So I will say, on a personal level, I really like the concept of a single semester, single season, or single season sport for wrestling. I think there's a lot of merit behind that thought process. I think there's a lot of positives that could come along with it. The flip side of that, it's really complex, and it's not a simple move either. And there are a lot of parts that go into that decision that we need to make sure we're factoring into the sport of wrestling specifically if we do go to 1 semester. I will tell you flat out, I am vehemently opposed to a fall season for wrestling. I think that would be a terrible idea for the sport. Wrestling has one of the highest percentages of first-generation college students of any sport in the NCAA. And I think the worst thing you can do is try and jam a full season into their first semester of school. I think we would see some pretty negative fallout from that. So I don't think that is a good decision. Spring semester, though, I think there's some real merit behind that concept and really exploring what a spring season could look like. Obviously, that's going to condense the season a little bit. But I don't know necessarily a bad thing for the sport, right? And the number of matches wrestled in a given year, it's a healthy number right now, but I think less matches isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as they're concentrated in the right ways. The biggest challenges I think you got to figure out what a dual season looks like and what a tournament season looks like, and kind of how do you balance those two, knowing you're going to have a few less weekends to compete. So, and then the other obviously huge piece of the puzzle is venues are a big challenge, right? So if you get further into the spring, and the venues that we're currently in, we run into the professional sports seasons where those venues are booked up for those sports, with the exception of football, obviously. And if we can get ourselves to the point where we can fill an arena like we were planning to do for Minnesota, I think that's amazing. It's a bummer that we couldn't get that tournament to see what a wrestling community could look like in an arena like that. But even that, I mean, covered facilities are really the only option for wrestling, and there's only so many of those out there. So there's some nuances to figure out. There'd be some tricky things we'd have to navigate. But I do think long-term, if we could figure out how to make a spring semester happen for wrestling, I think that'd be a really good thing for the sport.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of coaches that we've talked to have the same kind of sentiment, that first semester kind of puts people under the magnifying glass of terms of stress and having to really get dialed in with their weight cutting and their season. But then also for the first year guys get adjusted to being away from home. I did not know that wrestling is the number one sport with the highest first generation college athletes. Is that year after year after year usually for wrestling?
It's been fairly consistent over the last few years. And it's a huge bonus to the sport. Honestly, it's credit to the sport and to the diversity that we're bringing into the sport as well. It's something the NCAA looks at, and it's something that's important to the NCAA too. So making sure that no matter what we do, when we think about big changes to the sport, we keep that kind of in the back of our minds, I think is kind of critical to whatever direction we end up going.
Being on the administration side of things, you know, in the sport of wrestling, we're always talking about growing wrestling, right? Whether it be someone cutting a promo or kind of acting kind of off color to get people to watch them. How do you think we should be growing the sport of wrestling? Do you have any ideas that, you know, you got tossing around?
That's a great question. So the easiest first answer is I think we really need to be focused on women's wrestling right now. And I think we as male wrestlers need to be advocating for and supporting women's wrestling at the collegiate level right now. It's one of the fastest growing sports in the country. It is really doing some great things. We're having incredible international success in the sport. And it's one of the few sports out there where the rules between men's and women's sports are almost identical too, right? So, you know, it's an easy community to grow. It's also a fan base that has been historically untapped in the wrestling world too, right? The more women we have wrestling, the more women who are interested in wrestling. When you figure out what that can look like to have both teams going at the same time, I think it's a pretty exciting proposition and can do some really cool stuff. You know, beyond that, I think there's some really great stories in wrestling, and we just don't do a good job of telling those stories. We tend to latch onto a few here and there, and they tend to be the loudest ones, but not necessarily the best stories. So it's one thing to be flashy and have these crazy promos and all these fake beefs and, you know, all this silliness. But there's some great, like, feel good real life stories out there too. And there's some media places that cover that well, but you know, the fact that we talk about wrestling being one of the highest percentage of first generation college students, that's a story in and of itself, that there are avenues and paths that wrestlers have taken to get into colleges that you don't hear about very often, right? And those are the stories that I think inspire people to want to follow and root for somebody too. You're always going to have your other amazing stories. You're going to have your Gable Stevenson story, who's just like a dude and awesome, and you can't help but root for him because he's just a great guy and he's doing amazing things for the sport. But there's going to be some smaller stories that I think can generate interest and get people excited. But one of the hardest things we're always going to have to deal with in this sport is we're always going to be competing against basketball, right? We're always going to compete against March Madness at the end of the day, as long as we stay with the seasons as they are. And that's a real challenge because that is a huge national conversation from, I would say, January through March. Everybody's focused on college basketball, and college basketball is going to drown out college wrestling, unfortunately, to a broader audience outside of the wrestling community.
And as someone who's a two-time NCAA champ, you obviously had to deal with that coming up as an athlete. Did you have a chip on your shoulder with that, or because you went to UPenn, you kind of, everyone knew who you were because it was a little bit of a smaller school?
No, nobody knew who I was. I went to a school. So I came to Penn. We have 33 sports here at Penn. On any given day, I struggle to name those 33 sports, and I've worked here for 12 years. We have 1,000 student athletes, so we're like a significant chunk of the student body here. I'm also not the biggest guy on the planet, so I don't exactly stand out in a crowd either. I had a chip on my shoulder, but not necessarily from competing with other sports for attention or kind of like comparing myself to X, Y, or Z sport here on campus. Yeah, it's a interesting question because with so many sports here, it's easy to get lost in the crowd. But, you know, at the end of the day, and I always tell our student athletes here the same thing, you know, if you want attention and you want to be in the spotlight, then you got to earn it at the end of the day. And that's the only way you're really going to get it, no matter what sport you're in. So yeah. Competing against those sports for attention, always challenging, but the easiest way to outshine them is to outshine them.
So speaking of 33 sports at UPenn, what's the most Ivy League sport you guys have?
Ivy League sport at Penn?
Yeah, like, ooh. Is it fencing? Is it rowing? Or what is like the most Ivy League type sport in your opinion?
It's a great question. I'm probably going to have to go with squash.
All right.
I'll be honest, I didn't know what squash was until I got to college. I thought it was a fruit. I really had no clue. I was like, oh, you're going to go play squash? That's really, why would you step on that? That's weird. But then actually I got to learn about the sport, and I very much appreciate the sport now for what it is. If never watched college squash or high level squash, I recommend it. There's some interesting parallels to wrestling. And I worked with squash for a number of years. One of my good friends is one of the squash coaches here. But it is a very, very Ivy League specific sport. There are a few other schools that have it, but really it's very Ivy.
Are those all 33 of those? Are they all NCAA sanctioned sports or some of those club sports?
None of them are club. They're all varsity sports, but they're not all NCAA sanctioned. So
Gotcha.
even squash, for example, isn't NCAA sanctioned. But we have a few sports that are varsity sports here at Penn, but not specifically NCAA sanctioned sports. We have a host of club sports as well, but 33 is the varsity number.
Okay, cool. And circling back to, growing the sport and specifically focusing in on women's wrestling, do you like the layout as it is in terms of how the women do freestyle, or do you think for having Division I programs, NCAA tournaments and stuff like that, it might be easier logistically to have folk style?
So the folk style freestyle debate is a really interesting one for me. And especially when you factor in women's wrestling. So I don't see a world ever where we don't have freestyle and Greco-Roman, right? I don't see Greco ever going away, even though I think some people are out there clamoring for that. I don't think that's ever going to happen, nor should it happen.
Yeah.
So when you think of that in the context of women's wrestling, you have to think at some point we're going to have women's Greco. That probably should happen at some point in the future. When you start going down that path, then do we start adding Greco to college wrestling for women specifically too? And how do you navigate that? That's part of the challenge with the freestyle, folk style debate with men's wrestling right now, right? Like some people are like, hey, just go freestyle in college. Well, we don't want to minimize the experience of Greco, and we want Greco to be phenomenal at an international level. If we just decide to focus in on freestyle at the end of the day, well, we're probably going to sacrifice Greco results. And I don't know that we as a country can or should do that. So it's a really interesting question because I'm not sure. I don't really know which way I would, like if I had to vote on that right now, I don't know which way I would vote. I'd want to know more. I think there's a lot of merit to wrestling this style in college that you're going to wrestle at the Olympic level. It's just a question of how do you navigate that, knowing you're going to have potentially two different rule sets at the college level for essentially the same sport. So it's a funky one. It's a tough one to answer.
So here's an idea. What if we do freestyle Greco in the fall and then folk style in the spring? Is that just way too much?
Way too much.
We're going to need ambulances for every wrestling practice from February through March. Probably a bit too much for them.
Yeah. How do we cut down on the wear and tear? Is that just a mindset and a training philosophy that, maybe cutting back on the live wrestling, or maybe not, because when I grew up, you had guys that were 3-sport athletes or gals that were 3-sport athletes. And now the trend is mostly like girls come into wrestling at a very early age, and that's their sport. And you saw that with an uptick with the soccer, where there was a lot of knee injuries because people were playing soccer year round and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how to, I don't necessarily want to say make the sport safer, but possibly reduce some of the in-season injuries?
Yeah, that's a really tough question as well. I think sport specialization has been a real issue across the board throughout our country over the last few years. I actually think that's coming back around a little bit. We're starting to see more recruits who are multi-sport athletes. I think that's a really good thing. I think just from a physiological standpoint, that's good for younger kids to develop different types of muscle and develop their bodies in slightly different ways. I'm also biased on this one. I played 3 sports all the way up to high school, and I played 2 sports all the way through high school. And I loved it. So I didn't just focus on wrestling. I wasn't just a wrestling guy in high school. I think there were 2 components of that benefited me. One, I didn't get burned out from wrestling, from just wrestling all the time. But 2, I also would get a mental break from wrestling, right? So I could I played soccer all the way through high school, and I could get out in the soccer field and be my terrible soccer playing self out in the soccer field, shank balls all over the place, but have fun doing it, and not really be in a pressure environment where I felt like, I needed to be winning all the time, or I wasn't going to get a scholarship to college, or I wasn't going to get looks for college, because I knew it was never going to happen in soccer anyway. But my body was just developing in a different way too, right? Running like that for soccer just kind of does different things for your body. So I think that's a very realistic way to start thinking about youth sports and younger athletes in sport. At the college level, I think our coaches need to just continue to grow and evolve, just like sports science continues to grow and evolve. I've been fortunate in my role here to work closely with our sports performance department and see all that goes into what they're looking at and what they're thinking about when they go into athletic training or strength and conditioning workouts. I think we need to continue to leverage that technology and look at, peaking and when to prioritize training at a high level and when to back off, and just kind of understanding when bodies break down. I think overtraining is a very real issue, and I think there are a lot of teams that struggle with that. And I think every year, probably about this time during the wrestling season, we see a peak in significant injuries across teams. And you're never going to escape that entirely. There's always going to, we're a violent sport. At the end of the day, we're a tough sport, and staying healthy is probably the single most significant factor in having success at the college level. But, guys learning about their body, understanding their body better, and coaches learning how to better manage those guys and understanding when they're beat up and don't need to be trained harder, I think is a huge piece of the puzzle. So yeah, it's a great question. But inherently wrestling is just a dang tough sport.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be really hard to avoid any kind of injuries.
And talking about working with the sports performance department, what do you see if you could go back? Like, oh man, I really missed the boat on that. Like I didn't have enough recovery there. Is there anything like that you see?
So one of the things that this is very specific, but I got a cool little look into is force plate technology and kind of how they're predicting potential injuries based on what we essentially call a jump test, but it's kind of the force that you are showing based on the jumps that you have, and the very specialized strength and conditioning work that comes along with that. So if you jump on the force plate and it indicates, hey, you're at higher risk for an ACL injury because your right knee seems to be weaker than your left knee, and we need to make sure we're strengthening your hamstring on your right side, but your quad on your left side. And they can get that specific in kind of how they look at things. Not that I had a ton of injuries, and I was very lucky throughout my career not to be injured too much. But to know, hey, you're a little bit more at risk for X, Y, or Z. Hey, you need to focus your lifting a little bit more on, do more shoulder work because it looks like your shoulders are getting a little loose right now. All right, get in there, do a whole bunch more overhead press because that's what you need. I think that would have been pretty cool to kind of experience that and see what that was like. That science has branched into kind of like the periodization of training now too, and understanding when to peak and when not to peak. I feel like when I was in school, we were like, yeah, let's train as hard as we can. Go. That was how you went about it. And hopefully your body held up. But yeah, it's pretty cool to see some of that coming through these days. And I would have enjoyed kind of learning about that as we went through it.
And talking about that technology, is that exclusive to you guys at UPenn, or is that pretty much across the board in the NCAA now, Division I?
It's a very quickly growing technology across the NCAA. There are a lot of schools who are using force plate technology, but also just using sports science specific technology in general. And the strength and conditioning world is learning about the different sports and the differences between sports and how to train athletes differently too, right? You can't train a football player the same way you train a wrestler, the same way you train a tennis player. Right? You're going to kill the tennis player if you try and train them like a football player, and a wrestler just doing bench press over and over again isn't going to be conducive to them doing well in wrestling. So they've started to really kind of fine tune and focus their craft to fit the sport specifically. And I think we're seeing a higher level of sport as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I've read some articles about football programs that have almost killed football players doing football workouts.
That is, unfortunately, is also true. That's probably not sports science
No.
in those groups. So.
It's called rhabdomyolysis. You mentioned that you managed to stay pretty injury free through your competitive days. I know you're a very busy guy with your role at UPenn now. Do you ever venture into the practice room at all?
So pre-pandemic, I was decent about getting in the room from time to time. So I was able to get on the mat a few times in that 1920 season, roll around with some of our little guys who were in the room back then. Since the pandemic, it's been a little bit tougher. Obviously, we had a full year away. And obviously, running shape and wrestling shape are not the same thing. Our guys, fortunately, found ways to work out and stay in wrestling shape. I did not. I also had a kid during that window, too. So between dad life and running life, my wrestling life is probably useful. Wrestling life is diminishing. I did get in the room a couple weeks ago and do a little bit of technique. I'm allowed to do that from time to time, so I got to go in there and do that. But this Penn wrestling group's also getting pretty darn good, and I'm a little anxious about getting on the mat with those guys because I have a little bit of pride left, and I don't want to fully toss that out the window.
Yeah, that's usually where the injuries come from, with that pride getting in the way.
Yep, and I know myself well enough to know that if I get in there and I try and go toe-to-toe with Michael Kolioko, it's probably not going to end well for me one way or the other. So
yeah. You mentioned running. Are you is that like something you do on a regular basis?
Casual, very casual runner at best. My bowed legs are not conducive to running, but it was definitely it was the pandemic workout of choice. So try and make sure I'm keeping myself at least fit and in shape and active, but yeah, definitely not a hardcore runner by any means.
Okay, but do you enjoy it?
I enjoy working out.
Okay.
I enjoy sweating.
Gotcha.
I hate running.
Okay.
But it's what works.
Right on. And you mentioned your dad. Was that your firstborn?
Yes, that was my firstborn.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
What's the dad life been like? Is it like everyone says? Did you get those feelings like of euphoria and everything when your child was born?
Absolutely. Super pumped, like through the moon excited when he was born. We have a labor and delivery story that's probably going to be amongst one of the most unique in history, I think. So definitely, I don't want to say put a dark cloud over everything, but definitely a cloud over everything. So my son was born on March 24th in 2020. March 23rd, 2020, the city of Philadelphia announced that we were having a citywide curfew due to COVID. And we weren't allowed to be out of our houses after 7 p.m. Starting March 24th. Starting March 23rd. March 23rd at 10 p.m., my wife and I drove to the hospital for my son to be born. And on the drive to the hospital, we were trying to figure out if they were going to allow me in the hospital or not. So a little bit of anxiety and stress, but all in all, things went well. And silver lining to having a pandemic baby is I got to be home for a lot of his life for the first year. So it's been a fun ride, but they didn't put this one in the parenting book that also never showed up in the mail.
So talking about your son, I know you come from a wrestling family.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you think about, or is that just a bridge you're going to cross when you get to it? How do you think you'll introduce your son to wrestling? Have you thought about
that? I definitely have front of mind because it's the number one question I think I get when everybody's like, "Oh, you had a son? All right, well, wait till you're gonna wrestle." And I was like, man, all right, we're there already. Probably not more than 157 pounds. No, I learned some good lessons from my dad and how he taught me about the sport. And I was very fortunate in that I had a very organic introduction to the sport, and I got to learn about and learn to love the sport on my own. I don't think I would have stuck with the sport as long as I did and stay as involved as I did for as long as I did if I didn't like the sport in that way. And I think that comes back to what I was talking about with burnout with some people, right? I think there's just too much focus on trying to like fit everybody into a sport or fit them into the sport that their parents did, or, parents living vicariously. That's a whole different conversation. But Yeah, for me and for my son, I mean, he's going to be in a ton of sports. We're going to let him do what he wants to do, and we'll let his interest kind of guide which direction he wants to go. There'll be a part of me that always hopes it's down the wrestling path. His height will probably dictate that to some degree too. He's probably screwed on that front. So his basketball dreams are going to be shattered very early in his career, or in his life, I should say. But yeah, I want to make sure that I introduce him to it and that he has the opportunity to explore it. But I want him to enjoy the sport and do the sport, hopefully at a high level that he loves and wants to be a part of at the end of the day. And if it's wrestling, I'll be through the moon, through the roof, excited. But if it's a different direction, then it's a different direction. I don't have any false hope of forcing my kid down one path or another.
And talking about your dad being very well with you with that, kind of letting you choose your own path. When you were wrestling, some of the biggest matches of your career, maybe in Division I, what was your mindset going into matches? Because as someone who watched you growing up in New Jersey and in college, you had some of the best technique I ever seen. Always like right on, like always to a T, perfect. Were you focusing on technique? Were you more concerned with that stuff than actually winning, or did you just make it look that easy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I still am, have always been a perfectionist. And I approached wrestling from that vantage point. That was a blessing and a curse for me. I was always hyper-focused on technique, particularly in practice. I wanted to make sure I did everything exactly right, that I had the right form, I had the right body shape, I had the right everything, that I was learning technique the right way. Even like learning scrambling, I was like, all right, I got to make sure I learn how to scramble the right way when I scramble. And that's a hard way to learn how to scramble. And at the same time, that held me back from probably being more offensive on my feet and being more attacking in general. So it was an interesting little internal debate that I had going on in my head every time I went into a match of like, all right, I got to open up and score points, but at the same time, got to make sure my technique is right, and I got to make sure I'm staying focused the whole time, and I, want to make sure that I'm sticking to my plan that I have in my head. Over time, I evolved with that a little bit more, and I definitely got better about ad-libbing a little in wrestling, but definitely I learned to stick to my cores a little bit more, my fundamentals that I learned growing up as a kid that I still believe are a huge part of wrestling success in general. But yeah, it was always an internal debate for me in my head of like, hey, good form, good technique, stay in the right positions, make sure you're doing this the right way, versus like go score some dang points and put some points on the board, and you should be beating this guy by 14, not by 3. So it was always an internal struggle for me.
And not to fanboy out too much, but you had the best mat return of all time. My buddy's dad, we used to train in his backyard, and we used to call them Valenti lifts. Just get in the crotch and lift the guy. But yeah, that was like, to me, because it was so simple, but you just made yourself look so strong, just dumping dudes on their heads. So I just got to give you dabs on that.
Appreciate that for sure. And it's funny, that's of all the technique and focus on like perfect form that I ever had, that's probably the one thing that I was like, I'm just going to do this. Let's see how it goes. And worked out pretty well for me. Now, my body type definitely helped with that one too, that, big butt and short legs, but appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, Shane Sparks for the Big Ten Network. He loves mat returns, so it'd be awesome to pull up one of your old matches and just have him go commentate it, because he's a big proponent of it. He even thinks, I think it was on Flow Wrestling, he might have said that you should get a point for a mat return.
I'd be in favor of that. I wouldn't want my matches by a heck of a lot more points.
Yeah.
But no, I don't know if that's the best move.
No,
but I'm gonna have to get Shane on a call together, and I'll give him the technical breakdown and mat downs while he's geeking out about it happening during a match.
Yeah. So speaking about the Big Ten Network, I know you've been announcing matches for UPenn. How's that been? You enjoy that?
I do. It's taken me a little while to warm up to it. It is not easy to do, and credit to anybody out there who is doing color commentary and play-by-play for any sport, for that matter. The hardest part is you don't realize how much downtime there is, right? Yep. Even in sport like wrestling, it's a 7-minute match, but there's a lot of time where you're just kind of sitting and you're like, hey, can you guys do something? Like, we know you're hand fighting hard, but like I can only explain hand fighting so many times to the crowd out there. But it's a really fun experience, and once you get the hang of it and really kind of like lean into it a little bit more, it can be really entertaining. And you got to obviously be receptive to feedback on that one, and good and bad, and learn how to adjust and grow as you go through it. But it's been pretty cool. It's been fun for me to kind of keep that as my avenue to stay pretty engaged and involved.
Was that something that they got in touch with you about, or was it just being in the athletic department, knowing that your wrestling pedigree that worked itself out?
So a couple of years, I actually started it probably 5 or 6 years ago. Our then wrestling SID at the time had our color guy call out at the last minute, and I had just gotten out of coaching, and he was like, hey, any chance you can, hop on the mic and call the match for us? And I was like, sure, why not? So I just kind of stumbled into it when he invited me to do that. And then he seemed to think I did a semi-decent job at that point, so stuck around and stuck with it. I actually backed away from it when I was on the rules committee because I felt like it was a little bit of a weird conflict of interest to be on a call, but also on the rules committee. So this year, now that I'm off the rules committee, I've kind of jumped back in.
Do you have to catch yourself sometimes? You get excited during big matches?
So yeah, absolutely. And especially when I'm calling a wrestling match for Penn, I'm like, I have to be as neutral as I can. And I'm glad the camera's not on me most of the time, because I'm definitely like calling, but like wrestling for the Penn guy while they're out there on the mat. And I'm glad it doesn't come through my voice when I'm saying it, but try and be as fair and neutral as I can. And that is not an easy thing to do when you're a huge fan of one team. But yeah, it's tricky, definitely tricky.
Yeah. We all do those moves in the stands. We're always shadow wrestling for somebody.
Poor play-by-play guy I called with last time. I think I like elbowed him in the ribs like 4 times. Oops.
So Matt, you talked about running before. I think having you on the call, we have to ask about the Penn Relays. We grew up as runners. Rich ran in the Penn Relays. What do you do when it comes to the Penn Relays? Do you have any kind of position involved in that? And what is that like for the University of Pennsylvania?
Sure. So I have no specific role in Penn Relays. I'm always around. I'm always available. I have volunteered in the past to do random things, whether it's like handing out programs or other stuff from time to time. But fortunately, I'm in a position now where I can just kind of get my all access pass and then fanboy out throughout the Penn Relays and just kind of like be on the infield, enjoying watching some amazing racing, which is such a blast. I mean, the event itself is so much fun. And we love hosting it here at Penn because of just the breadth and depth of like the teams that we bring in. Team Jamaica is awesome to have. They set up a huge festival outside of our football stadium where they have Jamaican food and Jamaican music, and it's just a huge party for them for like 4 days. But just being able to host some like elite level track athletes on our home turf. I'm actually sitting in the football stadium. My office is in the football stadium right now.
Cool.
So I can hear all of it happening when I'm working in my office for those 4 days when they're here. It's just such a cool event. And to see our football stadium packed to the gills with people. We didn't host it, obviously, the last 2 years, so we're excited to get it back again this year. We're really optimistic we'll get that crowd back. We're excited to get Jamaica back as well. So it's just such a fun event. And one of my favorite parts of Penn Relays is we do a really good job of engaging our local Philadelphia community, a lot of younger kids too. So we have middle school and young kids running in the event. They get to bump shoulders with some of these elite level Olympic athletes too. It's just cool to see them interacting and kind of having an opportunity to kind of rub shoulders with like the big names of the world. Like I will never forget Usain Bolt walking off the track and like the little kids just like wide-eyed, just like total in awe of Usain Bolt. So yeah, it's just an awesome event. And honestly, I can't wait to get it back here this year.
That's awesome. I'm glad to see that, things are a go for this year. And, there's such a pride in the wagon wheel, for the folks that are listening that don't necessarily know the Penn Relays like we do. go and look at, the Penn Relays awards, because the plaque that the winning team for each relay gets is literally the size of like a wagon wheel or a bicycle wheel from like a 12 speed. And I've been to quite a few different universities coaching cross country and track and field, where, Villanova, I've been there quite a few times for clinics and stuff. And they have like a hallway that is just lined, with wagon wheels because of the rich tradition. I would imagine it's a fine-tuned machine and well-oiled, but logistically, I'm sure there's probably a year that goes into each meet every year.
Oh yeah, it's a behemoth of an event to host, and there's just so many moving parts to it. Some of it is related to the age groups and the wide range of age groups that we have that compete in it. It's, navigating the sponsorships of, getting USA Track and Field, Nike, all of the top big names attached to it. Some years we don't know if Team USA is coming until like the Monday of Penn Relays. So trying to market the event. And, so yeah, we have a number of staff who are dedicated just to Penn Relays, who spend a good chunk of their time making sure they're getting prepared for Penn Relays each year. And we always joke that their work for the next Penn Relays always starts the Monday after Penn Relays is over. And they're always planning, they're always engaging on that. So yeah, it's a huge event, and a lot of our department mobilizes to help out.
That's awesome.
When you were a student, was that something that you would go and hang out down there, or not so much till you became an administrator?
As a student, so the Saturday of Penn Relays is like the big day of Penn Relays, when the USA versus the world typically happens. As a student, we would make sure we try to get down there to see that, especially because there were so many Olympians that were participating at that point. Like, you wanted to go down and see the best in the world go down and race. And I know I mentioned it already, but I'll keep pumping them up. The Jamaican crowd and how into it they get. It just is like an amazing atmosphere. It's so much fun.
Yeah, the crowds are on another level, especially if there's a big move that takes place, or someone comes from behind, and like the whole the backstretch just gets up, and they're whooping and hollering. It's electric for sure. It
is for sure. Yeah, that backstretch, that turn, when there's a close race or there's somebody making a huge comeback, drowns out everything else that's happening.
Matt, we have 4 rapid fire questions we ask all our guests.
Okay.
The first one is.
Well, don't forget we got some wrestling.
Oh yeah, and we got some wrestling specific. I almost forgot.
Okay.
So I guess I should ask first is what is your favorite wrestling shoe of all time?
I'm a Roulons guy.
Right on.
I was a big fan of the Roulons.
All right. Do you have one particular thing, if you were in charge of the rules committee or making the rules, do you have one thing that you would add or take away?
Headgear be optional.
Right on.
I fought for that one. Hard.
So as an old school Jersey guy, what do you think? Old school regions, or you like the new alignment, or are you an old school Region 1 guy, as we are old school Region 6 guys?
If I had to pick, I'd be old school regions. But at this point, I just want them to pick something and go with it.
Yeah.
I don't even know what's happening in Jersey wrestling anymore, because I'm just like, I'll watch states. That's it.
Being an Ivy League guy, I know you didn't participate in it, but do you like it in Atlantic City, or would you prefer to Jadwin Gym?
Atlantic City.
Yeah.
Atlantic City, Boardwalk Hall. I competed in the new Boardwalk Hall.
Okay.
Or the new convention center, not Boardwalk Hall, new convention center my freshman year. That was the worst.
Yeah.
Jadwin's fine. And it's not just my Penn bias, but Jadwin's fine. Boardwalk Hall is just so much cooler.
Gotcha.
Is it 125 or 125s?
125.
Is it stance in motion or stance end motion?
Oh, stance and motion. Oh, that debate was killing me. Oh.
I think I know where he's going on this one. Is it pork roll or Taylor ham?
Taylor ham.
Oh. And is it, I know your answer on this one, but is it states or state?
States.
Right on.
Yeah.
Matt, are you a coffee drinker?
I am.
How do you take your coffee? How do you brew your coffee?
Black, and brewing depends on what mood I'm in that day.
All right.
Do you get fancy at all?
I do. I do. I'll do pour over from time to time.
Respect.
You have a Chemex?
Not a Chemex. I'm blanking on the brand right now, but it's legit.
Okay. Well, when the mood strikes you, when you do want to get fancy with it, check out Third Wave Water.
Oh, okay.
It's a
Writing that down.
company. It's a company that makes a distilled water, and the water profile has the proper pH and the proper mineral balance that the International Barista Federation or whatever it is that the legit coffee houses are using their purified filtered water. So the guy that invented the company is a former NASA scientist, and he just couldn't figure out why he couldn't brew his coffee to get it to taste the way he did at his favorite coffee house. And then he took his NASA science stuff and dehydrated the water and made that profile, made it available. So you just get a gallon of distilled water, you add that Third Wave, and that's what's going to give you that, legit coffee house flavor. With that being said, do you have a favorite coffee spot in Philadelphia?
You guys familiar with La Colombe? Does that ring a bell at all? Okay. It's a very Philly specific roaster that has kind of grown. So they're kind of dropping down my list a little bit because they come a little bit too commercial. But
okay.
We were going there years ago when they were just like a little mom and pop shop. They were really darn good.
Cool. Do you have a favorite cheesesteak spot?
So Philly's known for two sandwiches, cheesesteak and the roast pork sandwich. I would choose a roast pork sandwich over a cheesesteak 10 times out of 10.
Okay.
Not a huge cheesesteak guy. Tommy Dinnick's down in Reading Terminal Market.
Cool.
Good to know.
Yep.
Matt, do you have a daily practice or ritual that you do on a regular basis to show up as the strongest version of yourself?
Great question. So it's not a very specific thing, but I'm an introvert naturally. So one of the things that I try and make sure that I do every day, now this was probably pre-dad life, but I try and make sure that I do every day is give myself at least 10 to 15 minutes of just quiet time, just to like decompress at the end of the day, compose my thoughts, kind of wrap up my day and close it out and just kind of settle down.
Matt, what are you listening to right now? Music-wise, audiobook? Are you reading anything? Podcast?
Other than Baby Shark? I've never been a huge music guy. My middle brother is in a band down in DC who've been doing some really cool and fun stuff. It's kind of like folksy type music called Oh He Dead is their band name. I've been loving their stuff lately. I've tried to get myself into podcasts when I can. I walk to work every day, so I try and make an effort to throw a podcast on when I walk in. So that's probably my go-to audio at the moment.
What podcasts do you frequent?
Bounce around. There's a lot of college athletics podcasts out there now that are real interesting, just kind of understanding, particularly in the COVID world, landscape of what's happening across different areas of the country in college athletics.
Cool. Matt, it's all right if you don't, but if you do you have a favorite conspiracy theory?
Ooh.
You ever seen Bigfoot up in the hills of Kittatinny?
It wouldn't be a conspiracy theory because I've seen him up there for sure. So that's a good one. That's a good question. There've been some good ones, especially in the last few years.
Yeah.
There was one floating around Philly for a little while after the 2020 election that I don't know if you guys saw the pictures of the guys dressed in mailbox costumes.
No.
That were outside of the convention center in Philadelphia. So the theory in Philadelphia was that those guys were the ones who fixed the election in Philadelphia. Which, even if no matter how you feel and think about all of that, if you thought the guys dressed as mailboxes were the ones who did it, you're probably a little off base because that's a terrible way to hide your effort.
Right on.
Matt, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome. It was epic to sit down and pick your brain for an hour. So thank you so much.
Appreciate it. My pleasure to chat with you guys, and appreciate the opportunity to catch up.
Yeah, good luck with the rest of the semester, and maybe we'll see you at Penn Relays one of these days.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Take care, Matt.
Have a good one.
Have a good day.